humor me for a second. Do you remember this game? What about this one? Or this one? Because if you said yes to literally any of these, you, my friend, played Flash games. And what's funny is back in the day, none of us thought Flash games were that important. They were just there. Flash games lived in browser tabs, in stolen free periods, in study halls where we were all pretending we were researching something educational, but in reality we were trying to get a weird-looking stick figure through an obstacle course. And they were basically designed for one purpose: killing time as efficiently as possible. But here's the thing. If you zoom out, Flash games weren't just distractions. They were the background noise of growing up online. And looking back, they were part of something way bigger. Because Flash games weren't just games. So today, we're digging back into that era. How Flash games exploded, why they took over the internet, and how they ended up becoming one of the most influential and most overlooked chapters in gaming history. Because I swear, Flash games walked so modern indie gaming could run. Alright, now to understand Flash games, we have to go back to the late 90s, when the internet was still kind of embarrassing. Like, it existed, but it wasn't sleek, it wasn't fast, it was dial-up. If you were alive for dial-up, you already know what I mean. You'd click on something and it would take like 12 business days to load. I'm not even exaggerating. It would take 10 minutes just to download one song, sometimes longer, which meant if you were making a mixtape for your upcoming road trip, you needed to start planning it way in advance. And it wasn't just annoying for users, it was a nightmare for web designers, because websites were trying to look cool, while also loading on what was basically a glorified toaster connected to the phone line. So naturally, the internet needed something better. And that's where Flash enters the story, and everything changes. In the mid-90s, a company called Future Wave Software was working on a program originally meant for tablet computers. But in 1996, they basically reworked it into a vector-based animation tool. And the reason that I mention this is because vector graphics could scale and load way smoother than chunky image files, which meant animated content could actually work online without your computer spontaneously combusting. They called it Future Splash Animator. And then it got picked up, rebranded, and became what we all remember as Macromedia Flash, or later renamed again to Adobe Flash. And this is the part where the internet goes from basic HTML and vibes to suddenly being full of animated intros, weird interactive menus, and sound effects that were always way too loud. Flash didn't just add animation, it gave the early internet a personality. And once people realized what Flash could do, it was basically over. Because suddenly the internet wasn't just text and links anymore. It could move, react, and play videos, which is why big platforms used it too, like YouTube, Hulu, and BBC Online. They all relied on Flash in the early days. But of course, once people realized Flash could do all that, amateur developers immediately went, okay, but what if we made games with it? And that's where the chaos truly begins. Because the gaming industry has always been obsessed with new technology. Every time something new shows up, developers immediately start poking it with a stick and saying, how far can we push this before it breaks? And Flash was no different. Flash made game creation faster, easier, and more accessible than it had ever been before. And it wasn't like today where you needed Unreal Engine knowledge, a team, and a marketing budget. A lot of these early Flash developers were just people with time, creativity, and maybe a slight caffeine addiction. Hey, look, no judgment here. They could make something small, upload it, and if it flopped, so what? I'll just make another one next week. And what's wild is that some of the biggest indie names we associate with modern gaming actually have Flash DNA. Super Meat Boy, Flash Origins. Bejeweled, Flash era success. So Flash wasn't just a silly browser thing. It was a training ground. It was a prototype factory. It was indie gaming before indie gaming even had a name. And it got big, like massive. Sites like Congregate and Newgrounds were pulling millions of users, and Flash games became a legitimate internet economy. To the point where Adobe bought Flash in 2006 for $3 billion, which is honestly insane when you think about it, because Adobe wasn't paying $3 billion for cool animations. They were paying for the engine of the internet. At the time, Adobe claimed Flash was installed on nearly 98% of internet-enabled desktops, which basically means Flash wasn't optional. Flash was the internet. And here's what made Flash games special. They weren't polished, they weren't perfect, they were weird. Flash was relatively easy to use, and it made the process of creating games insanely fast. Some games were made in weeks. Take the original Meat Boy, for example. It was created in about 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In less than a month, they created a full-fledged game. That is unhinged. And that speed created a specific Flash vibe. Because if you've played Flash games, you already know the truth. They're not always visually stunning, to put it politely. Some of them looked like they were drawn in Microsoft Paint by someone running on 2 hours of sleep and pure spite. Probably because they were, but that's besides the point. But you know what? That's what made them charming. Flash games weren't trying to compete with AAA studios. They didn't need photorealism. They didn't need cinematic cutscenes. They just needed to load fast, play fast, and give you a dopamine hit before your teacher walked by. Because Flash gaming was accessible in a way console gaming just wasn't. No $400 console, no controllers, no discs. You didn't even have to worry about whether the game was going to even run on your PC. All you needed was a computer, a browser, and the ability to pretend you were doing your homework. And I swear, if you went to middle school or high school in the 2000s, Flash games were basically part of the curriculum. Or at least you wished they were. And everybody had their favorites. Some kids were obsessed with physics games. Some loved tower defense. Some were even deep in stick figure combat lore, like their life depended on it. And for me personally, researching this video unlocked memories I forgot I even had. Like, dude, I can remember going into computer class in middle school and high school, and the first thing my friends and I would do is go online and find games to play while we waited for class to start. Even in study hall, if we were in a classroom that had computers, you'd find us grouped together trying out the latest platformers or playing this sugar game. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I'll have to see if I can find it, and I'll go ahead and put it on the screen. But that game had me in a chokehold. I loved it so much. And physics games were also really big in my friend group. But it's crazy looking back and realizing how much impact something so simple had on your life. It created so many good memories with my friends that I just wouldn't trade for anything. Because Flash games weren't just something we played. They were something we shared. They were social, communal, and they were part of the internet learning how to be a culture. And honestly, it's kind of insane how much impact they had for something that felt so casual at the time. Which is why I genuinely think Flash games deserve more respect in gaming history than they get. Because if you ignore them, you're ignoring an entire generation's entry point into gaming. Now, we can't talk about Flash games without talking about Newgrounds. Because if Flash games had a capital city, Newgrounds was it. And it all starts with a guy named Tom Fulp, who basically accidentally helped build one of the most influential platforms in internet history. Newgrounds originally started as a place for message boards where people could talk about games. And the name actually came from a fanzine Fulp made when he was 13, dedicated to the Neo Geo console, which is already iconic behavior, honestly. But as the site grew, Fulp noticed something. People were tired of the big AAA titles. They wanted something new, something weird, something made by regular people. So, Fulp started making games himself. and some of them were, let's say, aggressively 90s edgy. One of his early games was literally called Club a Seal, where players clicked on pictures of seals to, well, club them. Another game let players assassinate popular celebrities. So, yeah, the internet has always been like this. What can I say? But at the time, the tech was clunky. Fulp described having to animate in Deluxe Paint, move files to his PC, then program everything in Pascal. And basically, none of it worked smoothly unless you got into, quote, crazy graphics programming, which is when he found Flash. And Flash made everything easier. Suddenly, games didn't have to be painful to build, and Newgrounds became the place where creators could upload content and actually get seen, because Newgrounds introduced a feature called the Portal, a section where users could upload their own games and animations for everyone else to play. And that matters because at the time, there weren't really other places doing this at this scale. Eventually, instead of emailing files to Tom Fulp for him to upload manually, in 2000, he automated the process. Creators could upload instantly. And just like that, game discovery changed. Because now the internet wasn't just consuming games, it was producing them constantly. Now, as you can probably guess, the second something becomes wildly popular on the internet, it takes about 5 minutes before someone goes, okay, so, can we monetize this? And honestly, that's fair, because even though Flash games were quick to make compared to modern games, they still took real work, real time, real skill, and real effort. You're not just doodling in MS Paint and calling it a day. You're designing levels, coding mechanics, balancing difficulty, testing it, fixing it, then uploading it and praying to the almighty computer gods that it doesn't break the second someone clicks play. So, eventually, the Flash world started shifting, because creators weren't just making games for fun anymore. They were starting to ask, wait a second, could this actually be a job? And the answer, for a while, was surprisingly, yeah, kind of. By the mid-2000s, Flash games were pulling in millions of players every single day. And the big Flash sites like Newgrounds, Congregate, and Armor Games were in a race for attention. Because in the Flash era, attention was currency. The site with the best games got the most traffic. The site with the most traffic got the most ad money. And the site with the most ad money could keep growing. So, what did these platforms start doing? They started paying creators for exclusivity. Basically, they went to creators and said, hey, upload your game here first, put our logo on it, and let us be the official home of this game. And this became one of the defining business models of Flash gaming. Some sites would sponsor a game and get their branding on the loading screen. Some would pay to be the exclusive host. And others would negotiate deals where the game couldn't be uploaded anywhere else for a set amount of time. Which sounds pretty normal now because exclusivity deals are everywhere in gaming. But at the time, this was new. And for indie creators, it was a game changer. Because suddenly, you didn't need a publisher, you didn't need a studio, and you didn't need to pitch to anyone in a suit who just didn't understand your game anyway. You just needed to make something good enough that a portal site wanted it. And once that system kicked in, Flash game development went from fun hobby to actual hustle. And naturally, sponsorships weren't the only way money entered the scene. Because as Flash portals got bigger, they started running ads everywhere. Banner ads, sidebar ads, pop-ups, and eventually pre-roll ads. Which means, yes, Flash games walked so YouTube ads could sprint full force. And I know, ads are annoying, but from a business standpoint, it made perfect sense. These websites weren't just communities anymore. They were becoming full-on entertainment platforms. And with millions of people logging in daily, advertisers wanted a piece of that traffic. So, Flash portals turned into something that looked a lot like the modern internet economy. Free content funded by ads, supported by creators, and driven by clicks. And you know what? It worked. And here's the part that always surprises people. Because Flash games weren't just making some money. Some creators were making serious money. Edmund McMillan, one of the co-creators of Super Meat Boy, said that during the sponsorship boom, developers could make anywhere from $12,000 to even $20,000 per game, depending on their reputation. And that was just from sponsorship deals. They didn't even have to sell the rights to their game, which is honestly kind of insane. Because today we talk about indie developers struggling to make ends meet, and that's still very real. But for a brief moment in the mid-2000s, Flash gaming was basically a gold rush. If you were talented and consistent, you could carve out a living making weird little browser games. And keep in mind, we're talking mid-2000s money. That wasn't buy a small latte money like it is today. That was pay your rent and eat food like a real adult kind of money. And suddenly, the Flash scene wasn't just a hobbyist playground. It was an ecosystem. We're at the point now where Flash games start becoming a lot more important than people give them credit for. Because sponsorships and ad revenue created something the gaming industry hadn't really seen before. A new kind of semi-functional indie economy. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't stable, but it existed. And it gave creators the ability to experiment, to take risks, to make games that weren't designed for mass market appeal. Because if a game did well on Newgrounds or Congregate, it didn't just mean people liked it, it meant you could leverage that popularity into your next project. You could build a reputation, you could build an audience, and eventually you could jump from Flash fame into something bigger. And some developers did exactly that, because the Flash era didn't just create games, it created careers. It gave indie devs a proving ground where they could build skills, build fan bases, and build portfolios long before Steam became the default home for indie gaming. And this is the moment where Flash games stop being random internet distractions and start becoming something else entirely. The early blueprint for modern indie success. And even retailers noticed, which is wild. And this is how you know Flash gaming had reached peak cultural saturation. Retailers started paying attention. There were conversations about taking popular Flash games, bundling them onto discs, and selling them as physical products. Which is kind of hilarious to think about now, because, imagine if you're at Walmart in 2007 and you see a CD labeled The Best of Stick Figure Violence, Volume 3. But it makes sense. The demand was there for sure. People weren't just playing these games casually. They were obsessed. Flash games were becoming the internet's version of cult classics, and some of them were big enough that they didn't even feel like browser games anymore. They felt like legitimate gaming experiences. Just ones you played in an Internet Explorer tab while your mom thought you were doing homework. But of course, it couldn't last forever. And this is where the tone of the story starts shifting. Because if there's one rule in internet history, it's this. Every golden age comes with an expiration date. Flash games had reached a point where they were profitable, mainstream, and culturally massive. But behind the scenes, the cracks were starting to form. And once those cracks started spreading, the Flash empire didn't collapse overnight, but it did start bleeding out. And that leads us to the moment that arguably changed everything. Because eventually, Flash didn't just fade away, it got challenged. And the person who challenged it the hardest was Steve Jobs. Alright, so here's where the story goes from the fun internet nostalgia to a full-on tragedy. Because every empire falls eventually. And Flash's downfall didn't come from a single problem. It actually came from a pile of problems that kept stacking up until the internet collectively went, yeah, we can't keep doing this. And the first crack in Flash's armor was something it could never fully escape: security issues. Now, to be clear, the early internet was already kind of a lawless wasteland. You could download a single MP3 and accidentally install 17 viruses and a suspicious toolbar that permanently changed your homepage. You know, that was just the vibe. But Flash was a prime target for hackers, and not in a haha funny way, in a your computer's toast kind of way. Flash ran through a browser plugin, and that plugin became one of the most exploited pieces of software online. It constantly needed patches, and constantly needed updates, and constantly needed fixes. And for everyday users, it became this exhausting little choice. Do I keep Flash installed so I can play my games and watch videos? Or do I uninstall it so my laptop stops feeling like it's one click away from my financial ruin? And that tension kept growing because Flash wasn't just a tool anymore. It was starting to become a liability. Some websites even started blocking Flash content by default because they didn't want to deal with the risk. And if the internet is doing one thing consistently, it's choosing convenience over nostalgia. Every time. But security wasn't the only issue. Flash also had another reputation, and that reputation was it ran like garbage. Flash was heavy, it was demanding, and it chewed through system resources like it was personally offended by your CPU and wanted to exact its revenge. Sites running Flash content would slow down, browsers would start lagging, laptops would sound like they were preparing for takeoff, and your battery? Gone, reduced to atoms. Flash didn't just drain your battery, it also drained your will to live. So now, Flash had two major problems. One, it was risky. Two, it was inefficient. And those are the exact two things technology needs to not be if it wants to survive long term. But even with those issues, Flash still might have limped along for a few more years, if not for one massive shift in how people use the internet. Because in the late 2000s, the internet stopped being something you visited at a desk and started becoming something you carried in your pocket. And this is the part of the story where we have to talk about the invention that changed basically everything. The iPhone. In 2007, at the Macworld convention in San Francisco, Steve Jobs got on stage and unveiled a device that would eventually hijack modern life. Not just gaming, not just social media, life. The iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was a pocket-sized computer. You could call people, text people, browse the internet, watch videos, play games, and slowly we'd become incapable of existing in public without looking at a screen. And suddenly, the future of the internet wasn't desktops. It was mobile, which is where Flash made its biggest mistake. Flash was built for computers, not phones. Flash assumed you had a mouse and a keyboard, and you had a device powerful enough to handle it. And the iPhone was basically the opposite of that. The iPhone was touch-based, battery limited, and designed to run smoothly without overheating in someone's pocket. And Flash? Flash was the internet equivalent of a gas-guzzling SUV like the OG Hummer. Sure, it works, but it's not exactly built for the future. And here's the part where Flash's fate is basically sealed. Apple refused to support Flash on phones. No Flash plugin, no Flash games, no Flash video player, nothing. And this wasn't just a small decision. This was Apple saying, we're not building the future with Flash involved. And that decision mattered because Apple wasn't just releasing a phone. They were shaping the next era of internet design. So if the iPhone didn't support Flash, developers weren't going to keep relying on Flash. Because what's the point of building content that a growing chunk of the population literally cannot access? And to make it even more dramatic, Steve Jobs didn't just quietly block Flash and move on. No, he did what Steve Jobs always did. He made it personal. In 2010, Steve Jobs published an open letter titled Thoughts on Flash. And if you've never read it, the best way I can describe it is Steve Jobs looked at Flash and hit it with a historically accurate assassination. He starts by explaining that Apple and Adobe used to have a close relationship going back to the early days of desktop publishing. He even mentions that Apple was Adobe's first big customer and owned around 20% of the company for years. So at first, you're like, oh, wow, this is respectful, mature, professional. And then he basically says, anyway, Flash sucks, and we're not using it. He responds directly to Adobe's argument that Apple was blocking Flash for business reasons, like protecting the App Store. But Jobs claims the decision was technological. And then he starts listing his reasons like he's writing a breakup text with bullet points. According to Jobs, Flash had major issues. It was proprietary, not open. It had a terrible security record. It drained too much power. It wasn't designed for touchscreens. It ran poorly on mobile devices. And Apple didn't want a third-party software layer controlling the experience of their products. And one of the most brutal parts is when he addresses the claim that Apple users can't access the full web because so much web video was in Flash. Jobs basically says, yeah, and almost all of that video is also available in H.264, a modern format that works on Apple devices. In other words, we're not missing the web. The web is just outdated. Which is a wild thing to say publicly, but it's Steve Jobs, so of course he said it. The overall vibe of the letter is basically, I respect Adobe. We had good times, but Flash is old, messy, insecure, and it's not coming with us into the future. And once Apple made that stance public, other companies started taking notes. Because Apple wasn't just any company. Apple was the company setting the tone for what modern tech looked like. So Flash wasn't just being criticized, it was being declared obsolete. And here's the thing. Steve Jobs wasn't wrong about one major point. Flash wasn't the only option anymore. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, web technologies were catching up. HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript started offering the same kinds of features Flash used to dominate. But with one huge difference. They didn't require a plugin. They were built into browsers. HTML5 could handle video and audio natively. CSS3 could handle animation and styling. JavaScript could handle interactivity and game logic. And the best part, they were lighter, faster, more secure, and worked across more devices, including mobile. So while Flash was stuck being that one plugin you have to keep updating, the rest of the internet was moving toward a future where browsers could just do everything on their own. Flash wasn't evolving fast enough to keep up. And once mobile became the dominant way people access the internet, Flash was basically doomed. And this is when things start getting grim. Because once Flash's relevance started slipping, the Flash game economy started slipping with it. Sponsorships became less common. Portals weren't pulling the same traffic. The gold rush era of Flash game creation started fading. And at the same time, something else was rising. Mobile games. Because why would someone boot up a computer, open a browser, and scroll through a portal when they could just open their phone and play something instantly? Suddenly, the casual gaming audience wasn't living in computer labs anymore. They were living on the App Store. And that shift was absolutely brutal for Flash. And by the late 2010s, Flash was basically on life support. And in 2017, Adobe announced they would officially end support for Flash by 2020, which is a polite corporate way of saying, all right, everybody, pack it up, party's over. And once Flash stopped being supported, the consequences were immediate. Because Flash games weren't like console games where you could just pop in a disc and keep playing. They were browser-based. They relied on Flash existing. So if Flash died, the games died with it. And suddenly, we weren't just losing a platform, we were losing an entire era of gaming history. Millions of games, animations, interactive projects, all at risk of becoming unplayable overnight. Which raises the obvious question, what happens to a generation of games when the technology they rely on disappears? Do they just vanish? Do they get preserved? And if they do get preserved, who's doing it? Because it's not like Adobe was going to swoop in and save your favorite weird stick figure fighting game from 2004. So that brings us to the next part of the story. The part where a handful of people basically said, actually, no, we're not letting this disappear. So Flash is dying. Not metaphorically, like actually dying. Support is ending. browsers are dropping it, and suddenly this entire ecosystem of games, animations, and weird internet experiments is about to become unplayable. And that creates a really uncomfortable situation. Because it's not just that Flash games were popular, it's that they were fragile. They were never built to be permanent. They were built for a browser environment that no longer exists. So the internet basically hits a point where it realizes, oh, we might lose all of this. And that's where something interesting happens. People start trying to save it. Not corporations, not platforms, just people. There's this assumption a lot of people have about the internet, that if something exists online, it's permanent. But Flash games are basically the perfect counterexample to that idea. Because once the plugin dies, the games don't just become old, they become inaccessible. As in, you can still find them, but you can't actually play them, which is a very specific kind of digital loss. Almost worse than deletion, because the thing is, technically it's still there, just locked behind obsolete technology. And for a lot of people, that realization hit kind of late. But once it did, preservation efforts started popping up fast. One of the biggest preservation efforts to come out of this is Blue Maxima's Flashpoint. And Flashpoint is basically what happens when a group of internet archivists looks at 2000s Flash games and says, yeah, we're downloading all of it. The idea is simple, but the execution is massive. Flashpoint is an offline archive of Flash games and animations that lets you play them locally on your computer without needing a browser plugin. So instead of relying on Flash existing online, Flashpoint basically recreates the environment the game needs to run. It's like building a museum, but instead of looking at exhibits behind glass, you can actually pick them up and interact with them. And the scale is kind of ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of games have been archived through this project, including obscure ones that would have otherwise disappeared completely into dead links and forgotten forums. And the important part here isn't just that they saved popular games, it's that they saved everything. Because cultural history isn't just the hits, it's the weird experimental stuff too. The games that didn't win awards, the ones that barely had players, the ones someone made in a week and uploaded just to see what would happen. Flashpoint treats all of that as worth preserving, which is a very different mindset from how most of the internet works today. Then you have the Internet Archive, which is kind of the closest thing the internet has to a collective memory. Their goal has always been long-term preservation of digital media, and Flash games naturally became part of that mission. They started hosting playable Flash content and integrating emulation tools so people could still access games that would otherwise be lost. But the real breakthrough came when preservation stopped being just about storage and started being about playability. Because saving a file is one thing, making it runnable in a modern browser is something else entirely. And that's where another key piece of the puzzle comes in. Enter Ruffle. Ruffle is an open source Flash emulator written in Rust, and its whole purpose is basically, let's make Flash games work again, without Flash. Instead of relying on the original Flash plugin, which is gone, Ruffle recreates how Flash content behaves and translates it into something modern browsers can understand, which sounds simple when you say it fast, but it's actually incredibly complex, because you're not just running old games, you're rebuilding the environment they were designed for. And the important thing about Ruffle is that it doesn't just preserve files, it preserves interaction. Because a Flash game sitting in a folder is just data. But a Flash game you can actually click on, play, and experience, that's history you can interact with. And that's what Ruffle enables. It's one of the reasons sites like Newgrounds were able to survive the transition at all. Because instead of shutting down their archives, they could integrate emulation and keep a huge portion of their library playable, which is honestly kind of rare in internet history. Most platforms don't get a graceful transition like that. Newgrounds didn't die, it adapted. And speaking of Newgrounds, it's still here, which is already kind of surreal if you remember the Flash era. But what's even more interesting is that it didn't just become a nostalgic archive, it actively adapted. Newgrounds integrated emulation tools like Ruffles so that a lot of older Flash content is still playable directly on the site. And on top of that, it didn't stop producing new work, HTML5 games, animations, new creators, new communities. So instead of becoming a frozen museum of 2000s internet culture, it became a living version of it, which is kind of the best case scenario for any online platform that predates modern web standards. At this point, it's easy to think, okay, cool, people save some old games. But the reason this actually matters is bigger than nostalgia, because Flash games sit in this weird category of cultural history that we don't usually take seriously. They weren't blockbuster titles, they weren't physically owned, they weren't reviewed in traditional gaming magazines most of the time, but they were still formative. They shaped how people learn to interact with games. They introduced millions of people to game design, animation, humor, and online communities. And they documented what early internet creativity actually looked like when almost anything was possible and almost nothing was regulated. So when people started preserving Flash games, they weren't just saving entertainment. They were saving a record of what the internet used to be like when it was still figuring itself out. And maybe the most important thing Flash games teach us is this. The internet is really good at producing culture, but not very good at keeping it. Without preservation efforts, most of this era would have just vanished quietly. No announcement, no ceremony, just broken plugins and dead links. But because people cared enough to archive it, emulate it, and rebuild access to it, a lot of it is still here, playable, accessible, alive in a way that most early internet media never gets to be. And that leads into the final reflection of the story. Flash games weren't just a phase of gaming history. They were proof that digital culture needs active preservation, because if nobody saves it, it doesn't stick around on its own. Flash games may look at first glance like a weird little internet phase that we all went through. Something chaotic, something nostalgic, something you forget about until you randomly hear the Bejeweled soundtrack in your head at 2 a.m. But the more you zoom out, the more you realize something kind of important. Flash games weren't just a genre of games. They were a moment in internet history where creation and consumption were closer together than they are now. Because back then, the barrier between player and creator was unusually thin. If you had an idea, even a messy one, you could build it, you could upload it, and someone somewhere could play it within minutes. There was no publishing pipeline, approval processes, algorithms deciding whether it deserved attention, just access. And that access created something we don't really talk about enough when we talk about early internet culture. It created experimentation at scale. Flash games as a cultural snapshot. If you treat Flash games like old browser games and more like a cultural artifact, they start to look different. They show you what people were interested in when the internet was still new enough to feel like a playground. They show you what humor looked like before everything became optimized for virality. They show you what creativity looked like when it wasn't immediately shaped by monetization systems, recommendation algorithms, or platform rules. And that doesn't mean Flash was some perfect creative utopia. It wasn't. It had ads, sponsorship deals, competition, and eventually the same commercialization pressures every other digital space runs into. But it still had this early stage openness that's hard to replicate now. A kind of try it and see what happens energy that defined a lot of early internet culture. What makes Flash games interesting is that their decline didn't feel like a dramatic ending at the time. It felt gradual. New technologies slowly replaced them. Mobile games became more convenient, browsers stopped supporting plugins, web standards evolved. And at some point, Flash just wasn't part of the default internet experience anymore. There wasn't really a single moment where everyone collectively realized, oh, this era is over. It just stopped being there one day. And that's kind of the part that sticks with me the most. because most people don't notice when a digital era ends until after it's already gone, which is why the preservation efforts matter more than they might seem at first. Because without things like Flashpoint, the Internet Archive, and Ruffle, a lot of this history wouldn't just be hard to access. It would be gone in a practical sense, not erased from existence, but removed from experience. And there's a difference between knowing something existed and being able to actually interact with it. Preservation projects bridge that gap. They don't just store files, they restore access. They let people experience the internet in its earlier forms instead of just reading about it secondhand. And that's why Flash became one of the first major tests of digital preservation at scale. Not because they were the most important form of media ever created, but because they were one of the first to disappear in real time. If there's a broader takeaway from all of this, it's probably not just about Flash. It's about how quickly digital culture moves and how easily it can vanish if nobody actively maintains it. We tend to assume the internet remembers everything, but in reality, it only remembers what gets preserved. Everything else just fades into broken links, unsupported formats, and forgotten servers. Flash games are a reminder that online doesn't automatically mean permanent, and that even massive cultural moments can become inaccessible surprisingly fast. But they're also a reminder of something more hopeful, because when people realized that was happening, they did step in. They archived, rebuilt, emulated, preserved, not because it was profitable, but because it mattered to them. Flash games were never just games. They were experiments, playgrounds. They were the first time a lot of people realized you could just make something and share it with the world. And now most of them only exist because people refuse to let them disappear, which says something important. The internet doesn't preserve things by default. People do. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite Flash game was. Were you a physics game kid, or were you more into the platformers? Let me know. Also, if you liked this video, do me a favor and hit the like button. It tells the algorithm gods that this video is satisfactory and deserves to be shared with others. Also, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next video or the chance to vote on future video topics, because I will be starting to do that here soon. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, that's it for today. If you'll excuse me, I have some sugar to sort. I haven't played this game in years, so I'm a little rusty and I need to beat my old high score. Bye! You know, Flash games were the only era where you could say, I'm just gonna go try this game real quick, and 3 hours later, you're chugging Mountain Dew and emotionally invested in a stick figure storyline. Don't lie to me. You know what I'm talking about.